international allies. I think the United States and Europe mistakenly gave Israel a long rope, and we've been seeing all day the results of that in the devastating pictures of destruction coming out of Gaza. I think now you have a more concerted effort to say, draw this down, these pictures are unacceptable. The second part of this, Darren, is that I think you do have an Israeli government that is somewhat divided, and you do have a situation in which, if Israel gets sucked in deeper, then the 42 Israeli military casualties so far will increase in number, and it's very unclear that Israel will have an exit strategy. So I think it's a combination of those factors.
Yeah, and we're now hearing that the UN is offering Palestinian factions the same 24-hour ceasefire. Is Hamas likely to accept that from the UN rather than it seeming to come from Israel?
Well, I think there's been a very interesting development in the trajectory of this conflict throughout, which is early on, you had an attempt to say, let's have a ceasefire that excludes Hamas, that isn't negotiated with Hamas, and that humiliates Hamas. That was led by Egypt and Israel and the West. I think what you saw today in Paris was a very vivid demonstration of how much things had changed. You had the main interlocutors with Hamas, the Turkish and Qatari foreign ministers, I believe, in Paris with Secretary Kerry. The Egyptians weren't there. I think people belatedly understood that Egypt is really a party to this conflict. It has its own war with Hamas. It is only of limited use as a mediator. And therefore, I think that, yes, Hamas will be willing to extend the ceasefire. But the basic necessity here, and it's not a Hamas demand, I think it's a Gazan, as a position of most Gazans and Palestinians, and indeed should be of the world, is that if there is going to be a return to quiet, which is what needs to happen immediately, that has to then translate into some normalcy for Gazans, an end to the blockade. Otherwise, we'll be right back where we're beginning, and Israelis may have normalcy and quiet, but Palestinians in Gaza won't, and that will have to be addressed.
And it's an interesting point you make about the interlocutors who could bring peace. I mean, some say Egypt isn't an honest broker here, which is the point you're trying to make, that it wants to eradicate Hamas. How can the US and other players then leverage their diplomatic power against Israel?
Well, I think this is a question that relates to this very immediate conflict, but it also relates to an ongoing occupation that, unfortunately, American policy has, if anything, encouraged and defended and made possible. I don't think America is in a position to use its leverage with Israel, but in the big picture. But on occasions like this, it can certainly have an influence on Israeli thinking, as can the Europeans, who played an awful role during this conflict. The other thing, of course, is that they maintain no contacts with Hamas, which doesn't make them so useful. So I think the bigger picture is that perhaps both the results of the conflict so far, the absence of an exit strategy, and some elbow from its Western allies could encourage the Israelis to go for a more serious ceasefire. But beyond that, I fear we're going to be back exactly where we are in the bigger political picture between an occupied people and an occupying power.
A final thought from you, Daniel Levy. We've seen John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, put in a huge amount of legwork to bring a more robust peace initiative to the table. So how can they then bridge this gap that brings a ceasefire, that delivers Hamas its core demand of lifting the siege and also stops the rocket fire into Israel?
Well, I think the key thing here, Darren, is you have to create an incentive structure for Gazans, which says that if there is quiet and no rockets, then there will be a genuine change in their daily lives. Otherwise, you create precisely the wrong incentive structure. When the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, President Abbas, etc., agreed to end armed resistance, have negotiations, cooperate with security, all they got is more settlements. So again, the wrong lessons are being sent. I do think this time around, if they're going to be serious, you will need the international community to intervene more actively with opening the blockade on Gaza. Perhaps you have some kind of port arrangement. And I think that anyone who thinks that Gaza can demilitarize, which may be a worthy goal in itself, has to address the question of who's going to protect the Palestinians. So if you really want this to end. You may need a protection force both in the West Bank and Gaza. I don't think the international community is ready for that, unfortunately.
Daniel Levy, thanks for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, inside Gaza, people have been using the lull in the fighting to search for loved ones and their belongings. Often, all they find are the victims of the bombs and tank shells. Stephanie Decker has been in Beit Hanun, the north of the Gaza Strip, when a body was pulled from the rubble. Nicole Johnston reports from the devastated suburb of Jazeera. But first, to southern Gaza, where 20 members from the same family were laid to rest in the area of Khan Yunis. Al Jazeera's Charles Stratford was there.
He is the person who brings me food. Who's going to provide for me now?
It only took the push of a button, a split second for the Israeli military, to wipe out almost 20 members of Fatima's family. Remnants of their lives lay ripped apart in this hole in the ground. The blast ripped the skin off Mohammed's face. He and his brother Hussein were the only people in the house to survive.
We sell chickens and we go home. We have nothing to do with the resistance. We're civilians, just like everyone else.
We moved to the nearby village of El Khuzar. The Israeli military has been targeting what they say are Hamas tunnels. I'm standing about 200 metres from the border of the village of El Khuzar, which is near Khan Yunis. Now, the Israeli military say that during this humanitarian ceasefire, nobody can go into El Khuzar because they're still looking for what they say are Hamas-built tunnels. Now, there are a lot of people here waiting. They haven't seen their friends and relatives for a couple of days now. It was about half an hour ago that there were warning shots fired from that area over the crowd here, and a few minutes ago we saw a tank moving from left to right, but we cannot get any closer than this. 8 people were in this house when the Israeli shell hit. Miraculously, they all survived. We moved as close as we safely could. You could see the tanks kicking dust into the air. People here told us the Israeli military had confiscated their relatives' mobile phones.
The International Red Cross said they were going to come, but they haven't. There are dead people in their houses.
We demand Ban Ki-moon come to see what's happening on the ground. It's burning. There are bodies decomposing on the streets.
Where is the ceasefire? We have a right to see our relatives. Give us mercy.
The Israeli military fired more warning shots as a drone hovered overhead. We retreated back down the road. In a nearby cemetery, men struggled to lay the 19 members of the El Najjar family to rest. They frantically pulled earth into the tomb.
Netanyahu is criminal! Netanyahu commits crimes every day against our children and our old people too.
The Israelis are calling this a humanitarian ceasefire as the people of Gaza bury their dead. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
A 12-hour ceasefire that is negotiated means little. It means nothing to those that have lost everything. We're in Beit Hanun. This is an area in the north. And they're actually just pulling a body out of the rubble. And that is the sound of absolute grief as they're pulling people out of the houses here. We're being told that just before this ceasefire took place, Israeli warplanes hit this area in Beit Hanun extremely hard. There is areas of complete devastation. As you can see, they're still looking for more bodies. And people here will tell you, we met one lady, 70 years old, sitting on the side of the road, and she said, this has happened throughout my lifetime. Israel has come in, has killed us, and has devastated our lives. When will it stop?
We're in the central part of Jazeera, and it is utter devastation in this neighbourhood. Whole houses have been pummeled to the ground by Israeli airstrikes, as well as tank shelling from the eastern border with Israel. You can see that there is nothing left of this neighbourhood. All day people have been arriving here to take a look at what's left of their homes, if anything. They're going through the rubble, the concrete, looking for anything that's worth salvaging. We've seen people pick up mattresses, canisters. In one case, we saw a man with his bicycle lifted on his shoulders as he tried to walk over the rubble to get out of Jazeera. It's a really desperate situation here. And the people of Gaza are hoping that this 12-hour ceasefire will continue, that it will last for longer and give them more time to work out what they'll do next. Almost everyone in Jazeera has left this area. They're now living with relatives or the United Nations, but they don't know when they can possibly come home again and start to rebuild their houses and rebuild their lives.
Well, lots more still to come here on the programme. Fleeing their city, the rush to leave Donetsk as Ukrainian government troops close in. Plus...